The war had raged for years, and Earth stood at the center of a conflict that spanned the stars. The Tarshan Dominion, a ruthless empire of cold-blooded conquerors, had descended upon humanity with fire and fury, expecting to break them as they had broken countless other species. But humans were not like the others. They fought with desperation, with defiance, and, most of all, with something the Tarshans could never understand: love. Captain Adrian Vale had never believed in fate. He believed in strategy, in tactics, in the brutal calculus of war. But fate, or something cruelly close to it, had thrown him into the path of Lieutenant Saria Voss, a woman who fought with a fire that burned brighter than any star. They met in the smoldering ruins of New Berlin, where the Tarshans had turned an entire city into ash. Saria had been pulling wounded civilians from a collapsed building when Adrian found her, bloodied but unyielding, cradling a child in her arms as enemy patrols prowled nearby. "You're insane," Adrian had whispered as he pulled her and the child into cover. "You're too late if you're just figuring that out now," she had whispered back, a smirk breaking through the dirt on her face. That was how it began. Through battle after battle, they fought side by side, lovers entwined in a war that sought to rip them apart. They were the kind of soldiers who should never have had time for love. But war had a way of making every second count. Their moments together were stolen between ambushes, in the quiet before the next storm of gunfire. Their love was whispered in the trenches, held together by the certainty that either could die at any moment. Then came the battle that changed everything. The Dominion's fleet descended upon Titan's Bastion, Earth's last great military outpost. The Tarshans had cracked the orbital defenses, and the ground war turned into a bloodbath. Adrian's unit was cut off, overwhelmed. Saria was supposed to be in the command center, far from the worst of the fighting, but she had never been one to stay behind. Adrian saw her fighting through the enemy lines, her pulse rifle glowing red-hot, her blade flashing in the darkness. She was a ghost in the firelight, a fury wrapped in human skin. And then she was gone. The explosion ripped through the battlefield, sending Adrian sprawling. His vision blurred, his ears rang, but all he could see was the spot where Saria had stood just moments before. He didn't remember how he got to her. His body moved on instinct, tearing through enemy lines, his rifle an extension of his rage. He found her pinned beneath the wreckage of a fallen dropship, her armor cracked, blood leaking from a wound at her side. "You're not dying here," Adrian growled, his voice raw as he lifted the debris with strength he didn't know he had. "That wasn't the plan," Saria coughed, her lips curling into a weak smile. "You always were too stubborn to let me go." "You think this is stubbornness? This is love," he whispered as he pulled her into his arms. "And love doesn't break." The battle raged around them, but Adrian didn't stop. He carried her through the fire and the fury, through bullets and blood, refusing to let the war take the one thing that mattered. The Tarshans learned something that day. They had believed humans were weak because they loved too much, but they had never faced a species willing to burn down the stars for the ones they loved. Titan's Bastion did not fall. Adrian and Saria fought on, their love written into the annals of war, whispered among soldiers like a legend. Because when love meets war, humanity does not break. It becomes unstoppable. The war was far from over. Titan's Bastion had held, but barely. The wreckage of fallen ships littered the battlefield, the air thick with smoke and the stench of burned metal. But for Adrian, none of it mattered. He had Saria in his arms, her heartbeat weak but steady, her fingers curled around the fabric of his torn uniform. The medics rushed to stabilize her, and he should have let them take her away, but he didn't. He held on until her eyes fluttered open, locking onto his with that fire that had drawn him to her in the first place. "Still here," she rasped, her voice barely above a whisper. "Always," Adrian said. They had survived, but survival was not victory. The Tarshans would return. Their fleets were endless, their hatred unwavering. The Dominion did not tolerate failure, and after their defeat at Titan's Bastion, their next attack would be even more ruthless. The War Council convened within hours of the battle's end, and Adrian was called in, still wearing his blood-stained armor. "The Dominion will strike again," General Hawthorne said, his scarred face set in a grim scowl. And next time, they won't just try to take Titan's bastion. They'll try to burn Earth itself. Silence hung in the war room. No one needed to ask the obvious question. How do we stop them? Adrian clenched his fists. We take the fight to them. A murmur spread through the council. The Dominion had been waging war for centuries, conquering species far older and more advanced than humanity. No one had ever dared to strike at the heart of their empire. No one had ever thought it possible. Until now. You're suggesting an offensive? One of the admirals scoffed. Our fleets are barely holding as it is. We'd be outnumbered 100 to 1. Adrian looked at Saria, still bandaged but standing at his side, her gaze fierce. She had seen the same thing he had in the battle. The Tartians feared something. They think love is a weakness, Saria said, her voice cutting through the tension. But they don't understand what humans do when we have something to fight for. They've never fought a species that refuses to break. The council deliberated for hours, but in the end, there was only one choice. Humanity had spent the war on the defensive, barely holding on. That had to change. It was time to show the Tartians what it meant to wage war against a species that fought with love in its heart. The invasion of Drakkar. The Dominion's heart was a world called Drakkar, a fortress planet where their rulers, cold, calculating warlords, commanded their endless legions. No species had ever brought war to its surface. No species had ever dared. Until now. The fleet that left Earth was not the largest in history. It was not the most advanced. But it carried something the Dominion did not understand. People willing to die not just for survival, but for each other. Adrian and Saria led the assault together, their dropship tearing through enemy fire as they descended onto the planet's surface. The Dominion's warriors fought like machines, ruthless and precise. But humans fought with desperation, with rage, with love. For every soldier who fell, another took their place, not out of duty, but because they could not bear to see their brothers and sisters fall alone. Adrian and Saria moved like a storm through the battlefield, their weapons an extension of their fury. They fought not for conquest, not for power, but for the right to live, to love, to hold each other without the shadow of war looming over them. And in the end, that was something the Tartians could not withstand. The fortress on Drakkar fell. The Dominion's warlords, so certain of their superiority, watched in horror as their armies crumbled. Because for the first time in history, they were not facing a species driven by fear or greed. They were facing a species that would burn entire worlds for the ones they loved. The war did not end that day, but it changed forever. The Tartians, for all their strength, could not understand why humanity refused to fall. Their fleets withdrew, their armies faltered, and the legend of humanity spread through the stars, not as conquerors, not as tyrants, but as something far more terrifying. A species that did not fight alone. A species that would never break. A species that, when love met war, would always endure. Adrian and Saria stood together in the ruins of the Tartian command center, the battle won but the future uncertain. Blood and sweat stained their armor, but their hands found each other, fingers intertwining. This isn't over, Saria murmured, glancing up at the dark skies, where enemy ships still lingered in retreat. No, Adrian agreed. But we're still here. And in that moment, with the fires of war still smoldering around them, they knew the truth. Love had made them unbreakable, and nothing in the universe could stop them now. The war should have ended. The fall of Drakkar had shattered the Tartian Dominion, scattering their fleets and leaving their warlords scrambling to maintain control. For the first time in centuries, the invincible empire bled. And yet, humanity knew better than to declare victory. Wounded beasts were the most dangerous, and the Dominion was far from dead. Adrian and Saria remained on the front lines, leading strike teams against the remnants of Tartian strongholds. Each battle was brutal, each victory hard-won. But something felt wrong. The Tartians were retreating too easily. Their once ruthless commanders abandoned worlds without a fight. The war was shifting, but no one knew why. Then, the disappearances began. Entire outposts went dark overnight. Elite squads sent to investigate never returned. Even the Dominion's own forces seemed to be vanishing. One day, a fleet was stationed in orbit. The next, only drifting wreckage remained. Adrian sat in the war room aboard the Horizon's Wrath, humanity's most advanced warship, staring at the tactical display. Red markers, Tarshan strongholds, were disappearing from the map one by one, not because of human victories, but because something else was taking them. "This isn't a war anymore," Saria said, standing beside him, arms crossed. "It's a hunt." The uneasy silence stretched between them. They had spent years fighting, bleeding, almost dying to turn the tide against the Dominion. Now, it felt like something far worse had stepped into the battlefield. Then came the distress signal. It came from Helios 9, a former Tarshan command station. A human scouting party had landed to secure the planet after reports of a Dominion retreat, but their transmission had been cut short. The last words recorded were burned into Adrian's mind. "They're not Tarshan. Oh God, they're not." Static. No screams. No battle. Just silence. The Horizon's Wrath reached Helios 9 in record time, but the planet was eerily still. No wreckage, no bodies, just an empty city where battle should have raged. Adrian and Saria led a squad down to the surface, their boots crunching against the glass-covered streets. Signs of a struggle were everywhere. Scorch marks on walls, weapons abandoned in the dirt, but no bodies. No blood. "They didn't run," Saria muttered, her grip tightening on her rifle. "They were taken." A shadow moved in the distance. Adrian barely had time to react before the first one struck. It dropped from the rooftops, a blur of impossible speed, slamming into the nearest soldier before he could even scream. Bones snapped. The thing, a nightmarish fusion of organic muscle and shifting metallic plating, tore through his armor like paper. "Contact!" Adrian roared, opening fire. The rest of the squad followed, the air filling with the deafening howl of plasma rounds. The creature twisted unnaturally, its body bending in ways no living thing should move, dodging bullets with impossible reflexes. Then it screamed. The sound burrowed into Adrian's skull, not just noise, but something deeper, something alive. His vision blurred. His pulse hammered in his ears. He could feel it, inside him, clawing at his mind. Saria pulled the trigger. A burst of blue plasma ripped through the creature's skull, sending it collapsing to the ground in a heap of writhing metallic tendrils. The moment it died, the pressure in Adrian's mind vanished. The squad was breathing hard, weapons still raised. "What the hell was that?" someone whispered. Adrian knelt, inspecting the corpse. It was nothing like the Tarshans. It wasn't like anything he had ever seen. This was something new. Then his radio crackled. "Captain Vale." The voice was distorted, inhuman, but there was something chillingly familiar about it. "We have been watching." Adrian exchanged a glance with Saria. This wasn't just another battle. This was the beginning of something far worse. The voice on the radio sent a chill through Adrian's spine, something primal and wrong vibrating in its distorted tone. The battlefield had gone quiet, as if the entire world was holding its breath. His squad stood frozen, rifles up, eyes darting between the shadows. "We have been watching." Saria stepped forward, her jaw tight. "Who are you?" she demanded. Silence. Then, static crackled again, and the voice whispered, closer now, as if it were inside their helmets. "We are what comes after war." Then the signal cut out. Adrian's gut twisted. He had fought Tarshans, seen monsters tear through human lines, watched cities burn. But this was different. There was no arrogance, no hunger for conquest, just certainty. Like this thing, whatever it was, had already won. The corpse at his feet twitched. A sharp, unnatural movement, like a puppet yanked by invisible strings. The tendrils in its chest slithered and twisted, reaching for something unseen. Then, with a sickening crack, its broken body jerked upright. "Burn it!" Adrian roared. Saria didn't hesitate. She fired first. A white-hot plasma burst, igniting the creature's remains. The moment the flames touched it, it screamed. Not in pain. Something else. A signal. A call. The sky answered. From the ruined towers of Helios 9, dozens of eyes blinked open in the darkness. Silhouettes crawled along the walls, spindly limbs stretching, joints bending in ways that should have been impossible. the air filled with the sound of skittering metal and something clicking, something alive. Then, they dropped. Fall back, Adrian bellowed. The squad opened fire, plasma rounds tearing through the wave of creatures that surged forward, their bodies shifting and reforming even as they fell. But for every one that burned, 2 more came. Adrian grabbed Saria's arm, hauling her toward the evac beacon. Command, we need immediate extraction. Now. Copy, Captain. Dropships en route. 2 minutes out. They wouldn't last 2 minutes. The first soldier screamed as something latched onto him from above, claws piercing through his helmet. Adrian turned just in time to see his body seize and stiffen, then go eerily still. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the man turned his head, unnaturally slow, staring at them. His eyes were gone. Just empty, pulsing darkness. Then he moved. Not staggered, moved. Faster than any human should. His limbs twisted, bones snapping into new angles, fingers stretching into razor-sharp claws. Adrian had seen death. This wasn't it. This was something worse. Saria fired first. The possessed soldier dodged, moving like a blur, but her second shot caught him in the chest. No scream. No hesitation. He just kept coming. Adrian grabbed a grenade, ripped the pin, and hurled it. Down. The explosion ripped through the battlefield, sending dust and fire into the air. For a moment, the creatures hesitated. That was all they needed. The dropships roared overhead, cannons blazing, carving a path through the swarm. Adrian grabbed Saria, pushing her onto the ramp as gunfire erupted around them. The last of the squad barely made it aboard before the ship lifted off, engines screaming. Adrian slumped against the bulkhead, his heart hammering. This wasn't just another enemy. The Tartians had been retreating because of this. The Dominion hadn't lost the war. They had abandoned it. Saria's voice was low, but steady. We just walked into something we don't understand. Adrian stared down at his hands, still shaking from the fight. No, he muttered. We just walked into something humanity was never supposed to find. The dropship rocketed away from Helios 9, but Adrian knew they weren't escaping. Not really. Whatever those things were, they weren't bound to a single planet. They were already spreading. The flight back to the Horizon's Wrath was silent. The squad sat in stunned horror, the reality sinking in. They had faced nightmares before, Tartian war machines, orbital bombardments, genocidal warlords. But this wasn't war. This was extinction. Saria sat beside Adrian, her fingers still gripping her rifle so tightly her knuckles had turned white. We need answers. Adrian exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. Yeah, and I think I know where to get them. The prison hold aboard the Horizon's Wrath held one of the last remaining high-ranking Tartian warlords, Vereshka, a monster responsible for the slaughter of thousands. He had been captured after the fall of Drakkar, locked away in chains of reinforced alloy, waiting to be tried for war crimes. Adrian and Saria entered the cold, dimly lit cell. Vereshka sat in the center, bound, his reptilian features calm despite his predicament. His glowing yellow eyes flicked up to them as the doors hissed shut. You should have let us kill you, the warlord rasped, his voice like gravel. You don't understand what you've awakened. Adrian leaned forward, fists on the table. Then explain it. Vereshka tilted his head, a slow, deliberate movement. You humans think you have one, that your defiance shattered the Dominion. You are wrong. His slitted pupils narrowed. We did not retreat because of you. We ran. Because we have seen them before. Saria crossed her arms, jaw tight. What are they? The warlord's lips curled back, revealing razor-sharp teeth. A force that does not conquer. It consumes. We call them the unbidden. They do not wage war. They do not negotiate. They do not leave survivors. His gaze darkened. They do not kill. They take. Adrian clenched his fists. So you just let them take your people? You let them win? Vereshka's jaw tightened. We did everything to stop them. We burned worlds, sacrificed entire fleets to slow them. And yet, they spread. You think you are strong because you fight for love? He leaned in, voice barely above a whisper. Then tell me, human, what will you do when the ones you love turn against you? Adrian's stomach twisted. He thought of the soldier back on Helios 9, his body bending, his eyes hollow. Saria stiffened. There has to be a way to stop them. Vereshka's nostrils flared. We thought so too. Silence hung in the cell, thick and suffocating. Then the alarms blared. Captain, we've got incoming. The comms officer's voice cracked with panic. They're here. Adrian and Saria bolted from the room, sprinting toward the command deck as the ship shuddered beneath them. By the time they reached the bridge, the Horizon's Wrath was already locked in battle. The view screen filled with a storm of darkness. Ships, not like anything they had ever seen, moved like living things, sleek and pulsating, shifting in shape as they closed in. Black tendrils slithered from their hulls, reaching, twisting, hungry. Fire everything, Adrian barked. The ship's cannons roared to life, streaks of plasma tearing through the void. Some of the enemy vessels exploded on impact, but others absorbed the fire, twisting as if adapting. Saria swore. They're learning. And then they struck. The tendrils pierced through the hull like knives, wrapping around the ship, pulling, invading. Screams echoed through the comms. Soldiers were vanishing, their bodies yanked into the darkness. Others turned, their voices distorting, their eyes blackening. Adrian grabbed Saria's wrist. We can't win this fight. She looked at him, her breath heavy, her expression torn between fury and something more dangerous, fear. Then what do we do? She whispered. Adrian turned to the communications officer. Broadcast a message. To everyone. Every fleet, every colony, every survivor. The officer hesitated. What do I say? Adrian took a breath. Tell them to run. The comms officer paled, but he relayed the message. Across the fleet, ships broke formation, jumping to light speed, fleeing into the unknown. Humanity was scattering to the winds, not to surrender, but to survive. The Horizon's Wrath buckled as the unbidden ships tore into it. The power flickered, alarms blaring. Saria grabbed Adrian's face, forcing him to look at her. We are not dying here. Adrian exhaled. Agreed. They sprinted to the last functional escape pod. The ship around them was collapsing, fire and shadow consuming everything. They barely made it inside before the doors slammed shut. The launch sequence engaged. As they ejected, Adrian looked out the viewport. The Horizon's Wrath was gone. Not exploded. Not destroyed. Gone. Consumed. Eaten. Saria gritted her teeth. Eyes locked on the empty void where their ship had been. This isn't the end. Adrian reached over, gripping her hand. No, he said. It's just the beginning. And as their pod disappeared into the vast unknown, humanity's war for survival truly began.